Tim Burton's Ed Wood is my favorite film of all time, and for good reason. It stars Johnny Depp as the so-called worst director of all time, and follows him through the production of his three most iconic movies, Glen or Glenda, Bride of the Monster, and Plan 9 from Outer Space. It's an extremely charming movie, rich with dorky humor, an inspirational tone, and it even provided the fuel for one of the internet's favorite jokes that I've never quite found funny.
Do I really have a face like a horse?
So today, I thought I'd crack open a scene from a film that's changed my life. You know, really rifle around the guts of a scene to figure out what's beneath the surface. Ladies and gentlemen, let's autopsy Ed Wood. The scene I'm going to be analyzing today is the one in which Ed meets Belle Lugosi for the first time. The scene sets up the important friendship between the characters, which is one of the pillars that the movie stands on. However, I won't be covering the full scene, but rather just the moment leading up to them meeting. I think that the first half of the scene is the real meat and potatoes of it anyway, and that the second half is a lot easier to map on your own. However, I might make that into a video on its own in the future, so feel free to let me know if you'd like to see that in the comments. What makes the scene special to me is the way in which it implements the fundamentals of visual storytelling in order to communicate an idea with the audience in a subtle way. It also happens to do this in less than a minute and a half and with little dialogue, which is kind of a flex if you ask me. The scene happens directly after Ed has been turned down from directing the Christine Jorgensen biopic by Screen Classics producer George Weiss.
I don't hire directors with burning desires to tell their stories. I make movies like Chained Girls.
A completely despondent Ed heads to a bar and proceeds to participate in every struggling creative's pastime, day drinking. Because when it's noon on a Tuesday and you can't find a psychic with tarot cards, you look for answers at the bottom of a bottle. The scene opens with a shot of Wood at the bar with his face obscured by smoke. The smoke conveys the fact that Ed will be spending the duration of the scene intoxicated and dulled by a mental haze. It's also a great visual metaphor for a quote the real Ed Wood says in Glen or Glenda, which is faithfully recreated later in the movie.
My mind's in a muddle, like in a thick fog.
Seconds later, we cut to a profile of the struggling director. The shot places Wood in the center of the frame, which tells the audience that we're about to focus on him as a character and get into his head for a while. This plays in direct contrast with most of the movie, which elects to portray Wood as more of a charismatic enigma. This shot also shows us that he's had 3 drinks, which confirms that he's intoxicated and that his perception of reality is somewhat skewed. Wood ends up paying for his drinks, and while walking to his car, stops at a funeral home, shocked by what he sees. This is when the scene really starts to take off, as it kicks into a moment of transition for Wood, who's shown standing outside the funeral home in broad daylight. The shot reminds me of the ending from The Searchers, when John Wayne's standing in a frame within a frame before turning his back to the audience and walking towards the Wild West. Only in Ed Wood, Wood is exiting the bright and playful Tinseltown, which is conveniently labeled behind him in order to engulf himself in something darker and more claustrophobic. It's the film temporarily transitioning from being a story in the spirit of Wood to being a peek into his subconscious mind, which is something we also got to see a bit of in Wood's actual movies like Glen or Glenda. The glass door and windows of the funeral home could also be seen as hinting towards how this moment has a reflective quality to it. While we never get an insert of Wood's reflection in the glass, the idea is played with a bit in the next shot, which is a POV from Ed's perspective and features a dolly towards the subject of his attention. We start behind the glass and work our way closer to it until we can clearly see past it and see that Ed is staring at the face of his childhood idol, Belle Lugosi. The weight placed on Lugosi in this sequence is undeniable, even if it is completely confounding for people watching the movie for the first time.
The title of this can only be labeled...
You see, at this point in the film, we haven't actually met Lugosi yet. The most we've seen of him was in a poster in the background of an earlier shot. We simply know that whoever this guy is, he's clearly important to Ed. Ed's getting closer to the funeral home represents the character, in his altered state of mind, acknowledging the darkness in his life and dropping the entire facade the film is based around. Wood eventually stops advancing towards the funeral home and enters a medium close-up that mirrors the profile we saw of him back at the bar. And the lighting is also the opposite of what was going on in Lugosi's shot, which communicates a certain level of symmetry or lack thereof between the two of them. This visual relationship helps iron in the point of the scene, and part of what's probably racing through Wood's mind at the time. Because while the audience doesn't know it yet, Belle Lugosi's role in Dracula changed his life.
You're not gonna believe the first picture I ever saw. It was your friend's Dracula.
Oh, that's incredible. That's the first picture I ever saw.
That is incredible. You know, I had to sleep with the lights on for a week.
I had to sleep with the lights on for a month, but I never missed a Lugosi picture after that one.
You see, Ed deified Belle Lugosi, and that isn't even just in the movie. Like, the real Ed would more or less cast Lugosi as God in Glen or Glenda.
You're like the god that looks over all the characters and oversees everything.
I don't understand.
You control everyone's fate. You're like the puppet master.
So the idea of Ed drunkenly stumbling on a dead Belle Lugosi isn't just a shock to him. On some level, it's Ed being forced to confront his failures as a creative, which is something we know he struggles with. The scene continues to build and gives us a few seconds to absorb what Ed must be feeling until suddenly...
Too constrictive. I can't even fold my arms.
Lugosi quickly realizes that he isn't in a Halloween-themed Sleepies and climbs to his feet in front of a thoroughly re-shocked Wood. At this point, the status quo has returned. Wood's optimism and faith in humanity is seemingly restored, and he goes on to form a relationship that allows him to make some movies. He's even later shown to be completely unfazed by not getting the Christine Jorgensen gig because of his excitement over meeting Lugosi.
No, I didn't get the job, but something better happened.
Better than not getting the job.
Yes.
And that's the scene, or at least the part of it I was looking to talk about today. The use of lighting and framing paint a portrait of where Ed was mentally at this point in the story, without needing to stop the film in its tracks to explain things. The film trusts us enough as an audience to figure things out on our own, or at least be moved on a subconscious level by the scene.
Filmmaking is not about the tiny details, it's about the big picture.
The big picture.
Yes.
Because after all, we don't even explicitly see Ed make these connections. So it's entirely possible that everything going on is going over his head as much as it is the audience's. But despite that, it's still there for us to behold in the final film. The scene works as well as it does for me because we're able to imply that it's important before we necessarily understand why. And in giving us the tiniest of peeks into the nightmare of ecstasy that is a drunk Ed Wood, it's allowing us to put ourselves in his shoes and understand him a bit more. The real Ed Wood never had much of a grasp on the skills needed to be a successful filmmaker, nor did he have the time or money to learn the craft. But what's really cool about this scene is the way in which it employs the film theory he never got to learn in order to let us get into his head for a bit. So while a lot of viewers may not have necessarily understood what he was thinking when he saw Lugosi in the coffin, we as an audience still know how this scene is supposed to make us feel. And in some ways, that allows us to understand Ed in a more intimate, albeit abstract, way than we would have gotten to otherwise.